Please make sure you bring those to class on Tuesday. If you finished it early and want to turn it in this week, you're welcome to do so. Does anybody have any questions about the project? My email had some kind of nervous breakdown over the weekend, so I may have lost a couple of messages. I think I answered all the emails that came in from students before my email went crazy. But if you did send me an email over the weekend and you didn't get a response yet, please email me again or come up and ask me after class, because I may have lost one or two emails in the process. So, if you didn't hear from me, it's not because I don't like you. Okay. Any questions or comments about the horse race, which is getting tighter for the presidential race? So it should be an interesting week. This week is the vice presidential debate, which I think a lot of people have been looking forward to. Should be fun. That's Thursday night in Kentucky. And then next week, a week from today, will be the second presidential debate. And actually, there is going to be a debate watch party hosted by the Political Science Department that's going to be held here in Searly. So on Thursday, I'll bring around a flyer with more information about it. But if you want to watch the debate with other students and have an opportunity to talk to some faculty members about the debate, please come to the debate watch party. And you can find out more information on our Facebook page, which I have now been deemed the new guy gets like all the fun jobs. I have now been designated as the Facebook administrator for the Political Science Department. So like us on Facebook, because I only have about 20 likes so far. So if you look up Department of Political Science on the UNI website, I'll try and post relevant announcements about activities and stuff, but not too much. I won't clutter up your feed, I promise. Okay. All right. So we left off last time kind of talking about some of the set powers of the president. Now, which article of the Constitution establishes the executive? Where do you go to find the enumerated powers of the president? No, they don't have an article. Okay. 8. So go in order of the perceived importance of the institutions by the framers. Not 4. We have 3 institutions, right? 3 main institutions of government. So which was the one they perceived to be most important? Congress. That's Article 1. So what would be the 2? Thank you. So Article 2 establishes the executive. And then, taking a wild guess, which one establishes the courts?
Article 4.
3. So we're going, so they go in order. And as you read Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3, you can see the length and specificity of each article declines, right? Because they were most preoccupied with determining the institutional setup of Congress and outlining its powers, because that's the institution they expected to be the most powerful and most significant. Next comes the executive in Article 2, and if you look at Article 2, you can see there are some enumerated powers of the president, but it's not nearly as detailed as Article 1, which has given the president a lot of leeway for development, right? The institution has been able to kind of fill up the ambiguities and emptiness of Article 2 with a lot of power. The ones that are specifically enumerated in Article 2 and actually in a couple of other places also in the Constitution where it overlaps with other institutions, the power to execute the law. So this is known as the Take Care Clause in Article 2. The President shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So that is an enumerated power. The power of military authority which is essentially the commander-in-chief clause, right, that makes the president the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Other enumerated powers include the power to issue pardons, which is a very important power, and a check on which institution? Judicial branch, right? So the ability to pardon people is particularly a check on the courts. The power of diplomacy, there's no diplomacy clause per se in the Constitution, but this includes powers to receive ambassadors, power to make appointments to our own ambassadorships, and the power to make treaties, right, subject to Senate ratification. So those kind of group together as diplomatic powers. We've talked a lot already about the power to veto legislation, right, which is an important check on Congress. And then obviously the power of appointment, which applies not only to the bureaucracy, to the executive itself, but also to the courts, right? So federal judges can also be appointed by the president, subject to Senate confirmation, right? So subject to the check of the Senate. Now, those are the express powers, the ones that are actually listed in the Constitution itself. The inherent or implied powers, so those powers that kind of go with the express powers, since the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, inherent in the power to direct the military is the power to wage war, right? Now, Congress has the power to declare war. And we're going to talk more in this unit about how the executive has taken more and more of the initiative in war making. But once Congress declares war, it's up to the president to actually choose how to wage that war. It's theoretically possible that Congress could declare war and we would do nothing, right? If the president disagreed with Congress about going to war, the president could simply refuse to order the troops into battle, right, as commander-in-chief. Now, that's an unlikely scenario, right? But it is theoretically possible under the Constitution as the checks and balances system. What we have had more of is actually instances where the president has waged war without a declaration of war. So it's been unheard of in our history to have Congress declare war and the president not do anything. In other words, the president check Congress's powers to declare war. It has been quite regular and normal for the president to wage war and without any declaration from Congress. The president also has power over domestic security. This comes in part from his ability to call in the militias, but it mainly comes in also as an implied part of the power to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. So in other words, to make sure that the rule of law exists in the country, right? So imagine if you had riots in the street, right? The breakdown, courts couldn't function because there were pickets of the courthouses and so forth. That would be an instance where the laws could not be faithfully executed, right? Because of the domestic unrest, right? And so what would be implied in the president's power to take care that the laws be faithfully executed is his ability to step in and ensure domestic peace. A very modest example of this was, I don't know, did we talk last time about when President Taft assigned a security detail for one of the justices of the Supreme Court? So I think I might have discussed this with another class. All right, one of our early sort of constitutional disputes over the scope of the power to execute the law for the president was that there was a threat against against the life of one of the Supreme Court justices during President Taft's administration. President Taft appointed a security detail for the Supreme Court justice to travel with him. Now, There's nothing in the Constitution that specifically says the president shall have the power to provide security for judges, right? And there was no law that Congress had passed authorizing the president to be able to assign security details to justices, right? He simply did. Now, an attack occurred on the Supreme Court justice's life, and the agent that had been assigned to protect the Supreme Court justice killed the attacker. Now, in order for that agent to avoid criminal charges, he had to show that he had killed this attacker as part of his job, right? That he had been duly appointed to provide security. This raised the question, what gave the president the authority to assign this security agent? There was no law that authorized him to do so. And there's nothing specific in the Constitution that says the president can do this. Can the president provide public officials with security?
We say it can't the power of domestic security, so that he could, like, if the justice were to be killed, then it would disrupt like how the judicial branch works, because it'd be short of justice. Plus, then that person, if they kill somebody, gets power to pardon.
Well, right. He could have alternatively, if the security agent had been convicted, right, he could have alternatively just pardoned, right? But the Supreme Court said that that was an inherent part of the power to execute the law, to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Part of that means that if, like you say, you had judges being killed, right, then that would disrupt the execution of the laws, right? And so that case was very important because it gave a very broad reading to what it means to take care that the laws be faithfully executed.
Plus, they probably wouldn't vote against it because, I mean, they want to be protected should something come against it.
Well, yes, the Supreme Court obviously had a vested interest, right, in saying, hey, we're going to vote in favor of us getting security details, right, if we need them. But that was a case where the Supreme Court had a very pragmatic reading of the Constitution because Article 2 just doesn't provide a lot of specifics, right, for what presidential power entails. Another power, which we'll talk more about in a little while, that is implied or inherent is the power to issue executive agreements. And these are agreements with other countries that the president negotiates independently and do not require ratification by the Senate, because treaties require Senate ratification. And originally, under the sort of initial sort of development of executive agreements, these were things like radio wave frequencies or postal rates between countries, right? Minor details, like, so what radio waves are we going to use, frequencies, right? So countries have to agree on these things, right? In order to communicate, they have to decide how much it's going to cost to mail a letter from one country to the other. Mundane details that it would be silly to go through a whole treaty-making process and get Senate ratification on. So that was the original sort of understanding of what executive agreements were. Agreements between nations hammered out by the executives that didn't require Senate ratification because they were considered too mundane for that process. Over time, the president has begun to use executive agreements for very high-level agreements between countries, like the return of the hostages from Iran in the late 1970s. That was actually hammered out between President Carter and then actually executed by President Reagan, who came into office. But that whole process of what we traded, essentially with Iran to get our hostages back, was all decided by executive agreement and basically avoided Congress, essentially. Didn't involve the Senate, essentially, in those negotiations. That's not a mundane matter, right, between nations. But that has become more commonplace. And then finally, we've talked before about executive privilege. What's executive privilege? power of executive privilege. What is the president doing when he claims executive privilege?
Is that when he's like, he won't release something to the public because it's like a matter of...
Well, he says a matter of security, right? So it's essentially the privilege to keep information confidential, right? And so that is considered, everybody since George Washington claimed this initially, that this was an inherent power in being an executive. An executive must receive candid advice. An executive must be able to ensure that the laws be faithfully executed. To do that, sometimes it requires confidentiality, right? That advice be confidential, that some of the workings of the executive be confidential. And so George Washington claimed that privilege as an inherent power, and all subsequent presidents have made the same claim. And obviously that results in fights between Congress, occasionally the courts and the presidency, but usually, typically, Congress and the president wrangle over what information can be kept confidential. And by the way, it's very common as one of the ways that Congress and the president work out these disputes over confidentiality is often the president will allow only certain members of Congress to have access to top secret information. So, for instance, what we do to deal with terrorism, then only a few select members, say maybe 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans from the relevant committee, could actually see that information. And then they must keep that information confidential. But that, at least, those kinds of arrangements are typical as ways to kind of hammer out confidentiality. I don't want to say too much about this. You can kind of look at your book. But we have a presidential system of government, and ours is fairly unusual. It was certainly extremely unusual at the time it was formed, right? So our system was a unique and new form of government, the way that we incorporated presidential government into our system. Great Britain still has a parliamentary democracy, which means the executive comes out of the legislature. So you elect members to parliament if you're in Great Britain, and then the parliament, always on a party line vote, chooses the executive, right? And so the prime minister, for instance, is chosen by parliament. And so consequently, parliament has total control over the executive. And the prime minister can be recalled, essentially. And parliament can dissolve the executive. That's completely different from our system of government. A few other systems in Latin America. France have adopted presidential systems, but most are different from ours. And when it says France is a mixed presidential system, what that essentially means is that they have both a prime minister and a president. So in other words, you have a prime minister who is the executive chosen by the legislature, and then you also have a separate election of a president. And in a mixed presidential system, the president actually holds powers. So, for instance, in a mixed system, you would have a prime minister who largely controls domestic issues and a president that might control foreign policy issues. And obviously, in those mixed systems, things can get a little messy. And from mixed system to mixed system, you might have a different balance of how those powers are split up. Now, in Great Britain, the prime minister carries out essentially all major functions, but who is the head of state in Great Britain? The Queen, right? So the Queen is the head of state, and so she opens Parliament and these sorts of things. But In Great Britain, it's all ceremonial. She no longer holds any significant power, other than some small amount of power over public opinion. But she's a figurehead, essentially. And most parliamentary systems will have a separate president or a monarch that does the state functions. And so it's actually unusual in the United States to have a president who is both the power holder and the head of state. As far as the states are concerned, all the states pretty much have a separation of power system like the federal system. So in other words, you have a governor, and the governor holds policy power, right? Has veto power, pardon power, ability to propose legislation, and so forth. If you go from state to state, you'll have variety in how powerful the governor is. So in some states, the governor is incredibly weak. And when you say a governor is weak, that means, for instance, if a governor cannot propose a budget, right? So if the governor does not have the power to propose the budget, that means the governor does not have a significant influence over policymaking, right, in the state. If the governor doesn't have a line item veto, which is the ability to veto select provisions of a law, that's a sign of a weak governor. A strong governor would have a line item veto.
Would you consider Terry Branstad like a weak governor, or just Iowa's governors in general?
I'm not sure where Iowa falls, but it's not one of the particularly weak governorships. Rhode Island has a very weak governor. Texas, actually, the governor is fairly weak in Texas. The lieutenant governor holds a lot of power in the state of Texas. So I've never heard anything that sort of sets Iowa apart on one end of the spectrum or the other, i.e. a particularly strong or a particularly weak governor. The key takeaway on the state forms of government is just to be aware, and this is true about state government generally, is to understand there's variation. So each state does it a little bit differently. This is true when it comes to the powers of their governor. This is true in their election systems. This is true in how their legislature operates. So whenever you're studying state governments, you always have to be aware that each state will do it a little bit differently. But all states have retained or have copied the federal separation of powers idea. So in other words, having a separate executive, legislature, and court system, each with a certain amount of independence from the other. So no state, for instance, has a parliamentary system where you elect your state representatives and then they choose the governor. One of the interesting questions to kind of just always ask yourself about American form of government is that we are unusual compared to the rest of the world. If you put the American system of government in comparison to other forms of government, we are unique. Very few countries model our system of government directly. Now, democracies have copied some features of American government, but very few governments copy us directly. In other words, say, hey, that worked in America, we're going to do that. And so one of the questions to ask yourself when thinking about that is why? What makes the American system so unique? And why have other countries avoided copying us directly? What do they think they've done to improve upon the American system, or why do they think the American system won't particularly work very well in other countries? Because most of the governments that exist in first world democracies around the world have been formed after the US government. We have one of the longest functioning constitutions. So America was out there as a model for virtually every other first world country in the world. And so why the differences? And that makes for some interesting questions to ask yourself about American, the nature of the size of our country, the nature of our population, the sort of diversity of this country, the economic diversity of this country, so forth, that makes possible certain forms of government that just won't work in other parts of the world. An issue that comes up, that has come up recently with the Muhammad video, was Americans tending to be puzzled by the fact that our concept of free speech is very different from most of the rest of the world. Our First Amendment is a far more aggressive protection of free speech than exists anywhere else in the world. The United States is unique in our commitment to civil liberties. Now, social rights, like a right to housing, a right to food, things like that, are typically more robust in other first world countries, but most other first world countries do not make it such a priority to aggressively protect both religious freedom and free speech. It's very unusual here. So our inability to kind of understand why people in the rest of the world were kind of freaking out about the fact that we were tolerating this Muhammad video is directly related to the fact that culturally, we have a country that tolerates a system of civil liberties that's more robust than a lot of other places. The mouse has decided to cooperate. All right, so initially, Congress was anticipated to be the most powerful institution, and there were concerns about the president. What they were really afraid of was that you had a history in Europe of monarchs who had basically treated their governments like as resources for war. So you had all these wars in Europe where it was really just about different monarchs going out and trying to battle for more land, more power, more money, and so forth. So there was an inherent skepticism about executive power. That essentially, if you gave power over a military, for instance, there was a lot of dispute at the founding of the country about whether a standing army was a good thing or a bad thing. Most founders were not interested in the standing army because they thought that was dangerous. Because if you have a standing army, then you have a ready and available force for an executive to take that army and go wage war, right, in order to aggrandize their own power. So the idea was to keep the president relatively limited. Over time, the president has kind of broken out of those initial constraints. So each individual president has essentially built on his predecessor to expand the scope of the presidency. Washington started the cabinet system and emphasized implied powers like diplomatic powers, saying he had the sole power to negotiate treaties. Executive privilege was another inherent power that Washington emphasized. So right out of the gate, George Washington set to expanding the scope of presidential power. The next big transformation after Washington was in the 19th century with Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, which we're going to talk about in a second, which made the president more accessible to the people directly. Remember, the founders didn't want the president directly connected to the people. Why not? what's potentially dangerous in having a direct kind of relationship between the president and the people? Where the people basically think the president, that's my guy.
You might take personal interest with certain groups.
That what?
You might take personal interest with certain groups.
Well, he might favor some groups over the other, but if the president says, I'm the representative of the people, then that gives the president a tremendous amount of power to do things on behalf of the people, right? And say, I'm taking this action because that's what the people want, right? And that's a very powerful,
But isn't the president just as many people like
what?
for the president to do stuff based on the people? Or the power comes from the people?
Well, remember, under the electoral college system, the goal was to keep the president detached from the population directly. So in other words, you'd have the electors choosing the president, not the people themselves. But that conception is going to be left in the dust. By the time Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren in the early 19th century take the presidency, they're going to basically push the idea that the president is your representative, that you elect the president and the president works for you. And that idea has led to the expansion of presidential power because it has basically allowed the president not to talk to Congress, right, but to talk to the people directly, which means that the president spends less time worrying about what Congress thinks of him. And if Congress stands up to the president looks to the people and says, vote these guys out of office because they're not doing what I need them to do as your representative. So do you understand how, it's hard because it's not like any formal thing, but whoever the people have an allegiance to, right? Do you feel more of an allegiance to the president or your member, your senator, and your representative?
I don't even know who they are.
Yeah, so you don't even know who they are, exactly. That's totally different from how the founders envisioned the system. But the simple fact that you don't even know who they are means that they can't come to you and say, the president is not doing what we need. We need to impeach the president, or we need to bring the president under control. The president comes to you and says, Congress is not cooperating with me. It's the president that always wins. Look, Bill Clinton had the highest approval ratings he ever had after the Republicans in Congress impeached him. And that's because he refused to acknowledge them. He talked directly to the people. So the rise of the sort of populist presidency has fundamentally transformed the institution. And that process started in the 19th century. So, the partisan and the populist presidency, what does that mean? The partisan presidency is just a term to capture the idea that the president is perceived as the head of his political party. And why is it important or significant that everybody thinks of the president as the head of his political party rather than the chair of the Republican or Democratic National Committee? Why isn't the chair of the committee the head of the political party? And what difference does it make? Will it be good or bad for Democrats if President Obama loses the election?
Bad.
Even if Democrats pick up some seats in Congress? What if the Republicans lose the presidential election, but they manage to gain control of both houses of Congress? Is that good for the Republican Party? Bad for the Republican Party? I mean, what are people going to perceive?
It's going to be good, but for them, right? But people think that either the Republicans are gonna turn for the moment to Democrat favor, or like they're gonna run the House great.
Right. Well, generally, we think the public generally thinks that the party's fortunes rise and fall with the president. And the fact of the matter is, you can control other institutions of government.
I would just say it'd be good for Republicans or Democrats, vice versa. Romney won and then Democrats control the House. But it'd be bad for America because it'd be a standstill.
Well, we do have a lot of, we have in recent history had a pattern of what's called divided government, which is where Congress and the presidency are in different, controlled by different parties. And some people like divided government because they like gridlock. They like the idea that the government can't actually do very much unless everybody agrees. But the fact of the matter is that from a political science perspective, there are a lot of good arguments for why it's better to control Congress than it is the presidency. Now, of course, that's if Congress actually takes aggressive action. But we generally don't perceive of it that way. We think the most important member of the party is the president. And one of the things that Martin Van Buren in particular, who followed up Andrew Jackson in the 19th century, he was Andrew Jackson's vice president and then became president in the next election. He created essentially the mass party system, where people identified with political parties like average, everyday people. And he also essentially created the idea that elections were important events. And this has actually waned somewhat because parties have become less powerful in our system. But in the 19th century, elections were treated kind of like sporting events, right? Everybody got involved in elections. You followed your party. You had, an election itself was a great social event, right? People would travel for miles to go vote, and there would be picnics and parties and everything else. So that whole idea of taking elections and party identification to the masses was developed essentially under Van Buren, who wanted to connect people to political parties, get them to strongly identify with one party or the other. The president makes a convenient figurehead for that system. And so the idea of coattails developed out of this. And what are coattails?
Isn't it just like ways to follow someone else's success?
Right, so if the president is highly popular and wins election, then the hope is that he will have coattails that carry members of his party through the congressional elections, right? And if a president isn't very popular, then sometimes they might even win re-election, but they won't carry a lot of their representatives with them. And over time, presidents have viewed their responsibility to getting members of their party elected to Congress differently. So some presidents have made it a priority to get out and campaign for members of Congress, right? And to leverage their own personal popularity to try and help members of their party get elected. Other presidents have done less of that. Obama, for instance, hasn't shown a lot of interest in trying to build the prospects for Democrats. And actually, he was fairly toxic in the 2010 elections, so he stayed out of them, more or less, in order not to harm, right? And George W. Bush was like never seen again once he left office because he was bad news, right? He had negative coattails for members of the Republican Party. So the tying of electoral fortunes of Congress to the presidency means the president's really powerful.
So like right now would be a good time for Mitt Romney to start trying to help all the other congressional people because he just had like a 9-point jump.
Well, yeah, although he's probably too busy. I mean, his race is too close, really.
Right. If he hadn't
you know, some of it is also depends on where you're popular. Right? Obviously, for the coattail effect, you want to go help people where you're popular, right? And so that's where you have the best bet of helping people out. Now, you're probably not going to see much effort on the part of either Romney or Obama to help out members, people trying to get elected to Congress, because they're locked in too close a racing to expend all their energy, right, on. But, you know, if you're winning going away, which we've had past presidents who know they're going to win. Like Bill Clinton was out busting his butt on the trail, even though he knew he was going to get reelected pretty much. And that helps bring, and you'll see this also at midterm elections, when the president's not up for election. How often in a midterm election cycle does the president go out and campaign with members of Congress to try and get them elected? That shows you what their priority is as far as helping build the party in Congress. Now, so the partisan presidency, that's fairly straightforward. The president is perceived as the head of their political party, and that creates a lot of power for the president over the party's agenda and initiatives. If it's a priority for the president, it becomes a priority for the party, and so forth. Think of it this way. Think about what do you think the Republican Party's priorities would be if between a Mitt Romney administration and a Rick Santorum administration? What do you think are the policy priorities of the Mitt Romney Republican Party? Like, assuming Mitt Romney gets elected, what do you think he's going to go do when he gets to Washington? What policies is he going to emphasize?
Economic policy.
Economic policy, jobs, tax relief, that sort of thing, right? I highly doubt a lot of presidential effort is going to be spilled on social issues at all in a Mitt Romney administration. What if it was a Rick Santorum administration?
Yeah.
A lot of social issues would be policy priorities, right? Now, this is not to say that Mitt Romney is going to completely ignore social policy issues, because he will have a base, right, to want to support, and Rick Santorum wouldn't completely ignore economic reforms. But the idea is that the president gets tremendous amount of control over what the party stands for, essentially. Okay. The populist presidency is what we were talking about a few minutes ago, with the idea of the direct connection between the president and the people. And the political science kind of term for the ability for the president to marshal the resource of his popularity to get his policy initiatives through is going public. So what does it mean to go public?
They use speech and like TV time to talk to the actual audience, like the people, instead of going to Congress or that.
Right, you don't go give a speech in Congress, you give a speech, right, to the people. Think of it this way, initially, so the president's